Welcome back to the New Wave Post-Punk Security Hour. We're listening to The Cure's Charlotte Sometimes with the lyrics, all the faces, all the voices blur, change to one face, change to one voice. It's based on a book of the same name that has a theme of identity and, to our AppSec ears, sounds a little like biometrics gone wrong. Which means this week we talk with David DeSanto from GitLab about the role of security in open source and the role of open source in building modern secure applications. In the news segment, curating code comments, patient payouts, seeing a forest of decision trees, adding encryption, analyzing encryption, Windows Hello versus pictures of you, and more. Grab eyeliner, hairspray, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop form jacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva. In any business today, there comes a moment. The moment you realize you can secure the code as fast as you write it. Instead of testing everything, you can just test the right things. It's not about tools, but intelligent risk management. That's the moment you choose Synopsys. Build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today.
This is episode 158, recorded July 19th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hello, host Mike Shima. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, and it's good to see that we both have a theme of blue this week. So I'll start thinking of all your new wave songs that have the word blue in it. And while you're thinking about that, I'd like to remind everybody that Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 8th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. Our call for presentations deadline has been extended, so write up your presentation, or at least write up an abstract, and go submit it to us. You have until July 23rd at midnight Eastern. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to submit your lovely presentation. In our July 22nd technical training at 11 a.m. Eastern, learn how guided SaaS NDR enables rapid response. Register now at securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. David is the Senior Director of Product Management for Security at GitLab. He is a network security professional with a deep background in security research and product strategy. David lives in the greater Dallas, Texas area with his wife and their 2 dogs. Hello, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a fun topic for us to talk about because it's open source and security. But I think we're also possibly going to get into community. So I don't want to do too much foreshadowing here. But let's just start off with the open source aspect. With, open source has been around for a long time. So I want to just set this up with a little bit of a preamble. But there's also some recurring themes that come up from open source. One is it's written for everyone to use, a lot of ways to collaborate on it, submit patches. But there can also be concerns, whether legitimate or not, about the security of open source. So let's just kind of maybe dive in from the 10,000-foot view, then dive in from there about what are the challenges that you've seen or heard from open source, and how has GitLab dived into addressing those or working with open source and security?
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of walk our way through those, I think you're right. I think there's been a misconception as to what open source means when talking about security. I think a lot of that has come from data breaches. You think of the Solarwinds attack. There's been other ones where someone points back and says, well, I pulled in this open source dependency, it introduces vulnerability, and thus it made my application vulnerable. And I really wanted it today for us to talk about it and figure out how to destigmatize open source, because I feel, and as you mentioned, GitLab plays a role in making sure open source is important in DevSecOps. And when looking at open source and the role it plays, you're right with your opening statement. The fact that there are a lot of people who can contribute means that everyone's working together to make things secure. And together, we can help each other out, which I think is the big thing you lose when talking about just proprietary software.
Yeah, I think that the DevSecOps is the good angle there too. And to the point of things like SolarWinds, and just last week, John and I talked about 20-year-old vulns 20 years ago in Microsoft software, so enterprise-built software, and we've seen software with vulnerabilities that actually have been discovered after at least a decade, both in open source and with closed source. So there's definitely a challenge there in the sense of we need many eyes to look at the security of open source, but a lot of times those eyes need to have some good capabilities behind them. So what are some ways we might be able to tackle in open source that aspect of vulnerabilities, or finding vulnerabilities, or maybe fixing them, so we can just build up a more secure ecosystem?
Yeah, so that's a great segue in, right? So I really think the thing that's missing when people talk about open source is the contribution angle, which gets into the community component you were touching on. People will consume open source and they feel that open source is there to help them, and that is true. However, as a user of open source, you should also be a contributor to open source. And that kind of gets into the vulnerability part you're talking about. And so let's say you're using package A. Package A has a vulnerability in it. You have found that vulnerability. Fix it, contribute it back. Now you're not just helping yourself be secure because you're trying to figure out how to secure yourself with that package, but you're now helping out everyone else with that. Because you're right, I think the scariest part, and doesn't need to be open source to be scary, is how long it could take to find a vulnerability, and how long was that vulnerability known for before, say, you found it. And as a person who is now leveraging open source, you're taking the step to fix the issue and submit it back. You're not just helping yourself. That could be a 10-fold, 100-fold improvement for lots of people. It could be a competitor, because sometimes that's the concern as to why you would contribute to open source. It could be a whole other market. Right, we could talk about 20-year-old vulnerabilities in Microsoft. You could also look at things like vulnerabilities in Apache, one of the main web services that are out there. The Apache, and this is probably about 7-8 years ago, had a vulnerability that was discovered, but it was actually existing for 7 to 8 years and was being used by a lot of different toolkits, so rootkits that are designed to help people attack, as I'm sure your audience is aware of. And that being fixed by the person who found it is not now just helping themselves or helping their industry or helping people they know. They're helping the entire world be more secure, and they're addressing that vulnerability. I think the key here is the second part of your question is like, how do I secure myself? How do I know it's secure? How I know I'm being safe? And I think that gets into DevSecOps best practices. I think people look at DevSecOps sometimes as, I'm validating my own software, but your own software is not just what you're writing, it's the packages you're using, the contributions from around the world. Everyone uses things like NTP, talked about web services, whether it's Apache, Nginx. People are using, in the case of Python, there's a date and time module that almost everyone uses. If you are using that package and you're treating it like it is your own software, you're now doing the same due diligence you would do for your own software, thus finding that vulnerability earlier. And again, getting to that first point, being able to contribute it back. I think that was the two parts of your question. I've been talking for a while, Mike, so I want to make sure I got all the
No, I think that's great. And I actually want to kind of talk a bit more about that responding to fix a vulnerability, because engineering teams, DevSecOps teams, actually have a couple choices available to them. And one might be to, yes, fix the bug, and submit it back to the community. But in some cases, it could be, what if, there are situations where they might be relying on a package that has been essentially become abandonware. So of course, yes, they can fix a bug, and if somebody else wants to use it, there just might not be a great population out there. But what I'm
for sure.
steering this part of the conversation to, you're a DevSecOps team. One, obviously, you can fix the vuln, especially in very popular, commonly used, pretty pervasive types of packages. But how does a DevSecOps team look at a package that might be closer to abandonware or forking, which are completely legitimate responses to open source software and adapting them? But what are some of the thought processes they might have to go to, or what are some of the engineering trade-offs they should consider as part of their strategy?
Yeah, you're kind of touching on the three things that can happen when you find that vulnerability, right? So you can first do the one I'm suggesting, which is write it yourself, fix the vulnerability, recontribute it. You have the option of internally forking it yourself, and that comes with its own additional overhead that you may or may not want to take on. And then there's the option of it's abandoned software, and now what do you do? And to that one, I think that's really where you, being an open source steward, you may be using something that looks abandoned because no one else is contributing to it, but it could still be relied upon by a lot of different organizations. And that kind of takes you back to maybe you should look at contributing what you saw as a fix. Now, I will add a caveat to that, of course, that I, in my time prior to going to the dark side and going into product, I was in engineering, led engineering teams, was a developer at the beginning of my career. And there is that concern that you're using something that is so old that no one's going to pick it up. And at that point, you need to find a replacement for that. And that could be, again, forking it, or it could be finding a newer package. I generally encourage people when they're looking at dependencies to look at recent contributions to that project. Is it a push once a year, but there's no activity over that time for the next push? Is it actively being contributed to? There's packages that get multiple updates a day, right? It just depends on who in that community is working on it. And then if it's been years, you yourself, now using that in your software, have to make the determination, what is the worst risk for you? And I think that kind of ties into what really, when you look at what happened in the Solarwinds attack, you look at other trends related to that, it gets into software needs to have a bill of materials, and there's a lot of talk about Sbombs and being able to have traceability. And I do believe that that's going to be the thing that's going to help everyone feel a little bit more comfortable with regards to pulling in third-party dependencies, not just the scanning of it, but knowing that it is a trusted package, you know where it came from, you have that traceability that you may not have on older projects that are reaching abandonware.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely aspects too of just SolarWinds also taught us the importance of the integrity of your CI/CD process, so that when you build that trusted package, or at least when you attest to a trusted package, that that attestment or attestation is actually valid and it hasn't been tampered with along the way. Curious there, talking a little bit more about the Sbomb, because you were bringing up these ideas of dependencies. And I think there could also be a bit of a trade-off, because on the one hand, there's that aspect of we, a DevOps team, are bringing in some software, some third-party software packages, and we may vet them, or maybe we don't vet them. Maybe we're just relying on some transitive trust and saying that, well, this has an Sbomb or other people are using it, therefore we need to align our code scanning or our in-depth verification on our first-party code, if you will, the code that we're writing as opposed to the code that we're using. So I'm not necessarily setting that up as that's the way things must be or actually happen, but I'm kind of curious with the idea of putting the effort into, or having a budget of engineering time, whether it is where to spend it on third-party code, first-party code, scanning, etc., that what does it start to look like in your experience as your, companies like GitLab, tooling companies, focusing on better ways to make these tools easier to apply, security tools easier to apply to code? And I'll just say code as first or third party.
Yeah, so you kind of touch on one of the reasons why I came to GitLab as part of my career. And I've been in security for longer than I should admit to, because I want everyone to think I'm a cool young hipster. But in the time up until I joined GitLab, I always felt like security was an important thing, but maybe it wasn't as friendly as it needed to be. And so when you talk about tool companies like GitLab, we wanted to look at security and make it approachable for the developer, which gets into your comment about the CI being key. So for doing scanning in a way that it's developer friendly, it allows you to scan as often as you need to scan and do incremental scanning. Something being native inside your DevOps workflow, in this case, built directly into your CI pipeline, allows you to get that security as close to that developer as you can possibly get it, while surfacing the results to the developer in a way that they can understand. There's a comment I like to make whenever talking about security and developers. Like, developers don't wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to write a critical vulnerability today in the application, right? They're saying, I want to write the best software I can. And I usually say tongue in cheek after that, like maybe there's a developer somewhere who wants to write nefarious code. It's possible, but I'm going to assume positive intent, assume everyone does not have that desire. They want to write good code. And giving secure results right before release, or them not being part of a cause and effect, I wrote these 7 lines of code, I now have this vulnerability, makes it very hard to address that vulnerability. And that can be both in the in-house written software, that first party, as you're referring to, software being written. That's also true about the third-party software. As I am developing and I am saying, and I'll use that time module example again with Python, it's like, I know I need to take action on timestamps, or I need to be able to calculate out duration. I need to do something as far as that. If I am scanning when my code invokes that package, I'm now validating that third-party application as if it's in-house written. Because when the code leaves your company, and that could be an internal app, so say leaving your internal development team, or it goes to a customer of yours, the customer's not going to be like, oh, that's totally fine. I get there's a vulnerability in that package. That wasn't your responsibility. Like, I know the difference in the binary, what you wrote versus what you compiled in. Like, that's not how the customer's going to look at it. They're going to be like, hey, you wrote this application and it has this vulnerability in it. And so you have to blur that line between what is first class or first person and that third person code, because that's how the end product looks like. It's not two separate things that you can point and choose what is yours and what is not when you deliver it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, and that's a common theme of saying, no, build the tools into the pipeline, make them available to the developers. I'm curious to maybe expand on that a bit. From a practical perspective, in your experience, how have you seen this be either most successful, or are there some pitfalls along the way that are ways to avoid just saying, security team comes along and says, you need to go buy some tools and make sure they integrate into your CI/CD pipeline. And I kind of doubt that might be a nice phrase, but I kind of doubt that's where the conversation ends successfully.
Yeah, so I'll use my life again as an example. When I was an engineering director before, that's exactly what happened. What you described. The security team came to me and said, "You now need to be scanning your software for vulnerabilities. Go buy a tool that works." I think the pitfall of that statement is it's making the assumption that I, as someone in engineering, and mind you, I will tell you, I was a security engineering leader, so I did know what to go look at, right? But not everyone has that background. You can go and you can select a tool. It may or may not meet the need. You can also go select that tool, and now you're asking your developers to learn something new. And that kind of ties into the pitfall, right? So making the assumption that anything is going to work, or someone who's not security minded understands what to choose, is going to lead to that issue where now I've selected something that doesn't work. I've selected something that I need to figure out how to bolt in. And it brings you to the final pitfall, which is now I've got to figure out how to get those results over to the developer who wrote the code that caused that vulnerability. And that could be easy. It could be very hard depending on how you're structured. And I think the nuance that a lot of people miss is there's a difference between saying I ran a security test as part of my CI/CD pipeline and I ran a security scan that is shifted left into my development workflow. And it becomes very apparent the difference between those when you look at something that is natively in the CI/CD pipeline, can run on a Delta code change, can run really quickly, can surface the results back to the developer and the person doing the code review, versus I now need the CI/CD pipeline to call another tool. The other tool is going to run a standard scan, which could take minutes, hours, days. If it's an external fuzz test, a week it could take to run. Now the results have to find their way back over, and now they're maybe printed out in the console of the job that was run by the CI pipeline. Maybe it's added as a random comment on an issue. Maybe it's just a link saying, developer, click here and go retrieve the results. Either way, to your point, it's not just that it's in the CI/CD pipeline, it's that it's in that CI/CD pipeline as a native functionality that shifts it to the development organization in a way they can understand. And I think doing that, and in my experience doing that, you end up getting everyone contributing to security, which goes back to the opening theme you talked about, which is open source in DevSecOps and open source in a modern application. Security is not one person's responsibility. I, again, at one point ran a red team, and my job was to validate all the apps the company had. We had hundreds of applications, and I had 5 people on my team. How am I going to test that many applications? Now, asking my team to work with the development organization and shifting that security left and it's Delta security scans, now we can collaborate together and together make the application more secure, make our organization more secure. And you can apply that same thing to your open source software you're pulling in and treat it like that first party component and give it that same level of scrutiny. And I think to kind of put the bow on that point, that goes back to now you can contribute fixes if you find them and make everyone more secure. You asked a little bit ago, what is GitLab's role or GitLab's view on all of this? And I will kind of sum it up pretty succinctly for you. So our application is available to everyone. Our source code is public. We're an open core company. We take that beyond what we just do. When I talk about fixing and contributing to open source, a lot of the security functionality that customers rely on GitLab for, if it's written in-house, you can see the source code, you can validate it. If we're pulling in an open source module, we're also scanning that as part of our building of our application, and we're contributing fixes upstream. I'm very proud by both our internal security team and our security product development organization for contributing to projects like Cilium, Trivy, SemGrep, and making everyone more secure. If everyone's working together, that's the only way everyone can be secure. And giving my life experience as that example, being on the other side of that, I'd much rather feel like I have a partner and not have someone who's looking at me and expecting me to figure out how to use something or figure out how to translate the results for them. And working together, everyone's more secure.
Go ahead, John.
You did a really good but really interesting job there of describing to people what, a lot of us refer to as developer first, but it's, shifting left to get to that developer first position where some of these tools, legacy tools, just can't get there. So I think that last 5 minutes of you talking there, I might use that as a copy and paste and send it to people when they're asking me what Dev First is. A point I want to bring up, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, it's been near and dear to my heart in the open source community, is contribution to open source isn't specifically just software. I'd say there's a large dearth of security people in open source, right? We tend to work on like the open source projects like the Nmaps and the Trivias and things like that, but there's so many other open source projects out there that, like, when you find that bug, like you said, as an example, being able to contribute that back is massive. But also just being able to say, your defaults aren't that great. As a security person, here's what I'd like to see different. Let me help improve the documentation. Let's actually talk about how to run this securely, not run as root. What's your thoughts around that sort of the general concept of working on contributions as more as just something that the engineer can do?
Yeah, so that's great. And please plagiarize everything I've said. That's totally cool. I think it's important to separate that and help people understand the difference. So You're right. I think the role people can have in open source is not just writing code. There's a lot of things that are amazing tools today, but they may run as root unless you take the time to set them up. And as a developer, you're aware of those types of permissions. So you could easily contribute documentation to help say how to set this up securely. And you can see that those types of contributions on some of the most common open source platforms that are out there and projects that are out there, because someone's taking the time to be like, hey, that defaults to a bad chmod permissions. If you change it to this, you'll have a more secure environment. And I would take what you said a step further and say, that's not just developers who can contribute. It's not just security people can contribute. Anyone can contribute to the open source project. I've had friends who are not security experts, they're not developers, but they're really good IT ops people. And they take the time to say, hey, here's a pitfall you can run into when connecting and configuring Kubernetes. And here's the quick checklist you can have to make sure you set it up securely. And those sorts of people on the ops side who are very skilled at what they do also have that unique knowledge that could benefit everyone. So to your point, yes, developers can definitely contribute, but others can contribute too. Everyone can contribute to that open source project or any open source project.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic theme to, it sounds like, John, especially, you're going to have to embrace and extend that open source, that ethos. And especially, I hadn't even been thinking of the documentation and secure defaults, or just that changing the architecture in subtle ways. So, not running as root, or drop privileges after you need something as root. So you minimize your attack surface. Kind of curious, and I'm think there's a segue to be made here because about metrics or measuring success. Let me just say, broadly speaking, David, is because you were talking a little bit before about putting a tool in and just saying, like, I don't think just saying we have a tool that has improved the developer experience, that's a good thing. That's not necessarily a metric of success from a security perspective. But you did mention about having security is everyone's responsibility, or a lot of participation. And that, to my mind, starts to sound like a better measure of success for security. And even as John was kind of positing on his question, that idea that security folks participating in non-security open source software, rather than writing yet another security tool, writing in the, looking at the Apaches or looking at the other broad tools that just developers are using as part of their code. So my long-winded way of asking this question is, what are some ways that you look for to see security be successful, or even measure measure security, if you will, of a project in general, open source or not?
Yeah, so I think you touched on like the final component that makes this topic so interesting. People will measure sometimes incorrectly. And to kind of give you a great real world example, and this goes back to where I was at Red Team organization, and we were doing work for another company. So we were contracted, and they were trying to meet PCI requirements, and we didn't see a WAF deployed anywhere. And when we asked the question, hey, on PCI like 5.3, point clause, whatever, it says you must have this. And they said, well, we have that. And they pointed to a closet, went over, opened the closet door, and the WAF was still in a box. And when asked why, they said, well, it says we must have it. It doesn't say we must be using it, it must be in line, it must be doing this, must be doing that. And that example applies directly into your question. So I could say, well, look, I am meeting the goal. It says I should run a SAST scan or a DAS scan, and check. I have those scanners, so we're good, we're great. And I think the challenge is security is a little more complex than just checking a box. You need to be measuring correctly. And some of the suggestions I usually make to people are, yes, let's validate you have security scans running. Maybe the next goal is make sure people are actually reviewing the results. The Target breach back in 2013, I think it was, they actually had FireEye devices deployed, and they were alerting them there was a vulnerability or a breach, but no one was looking at the logs, right? So let's make sure you're measuring that people are looking at it, and you can do that by triaging of vulnerabilities. I think the best way to measure is to measure escape rate and treat it like a normal defect. So look at trends over time. Am I continually having the same amount of vulnerabilities every time we go to release? Am I having the same vulnerabilities every time someone, like a developer, checks in code? Are they always introducing the same type of vulnerability? How often are vulnerabilities reoccurring? Are we reintroducing the same problem over and over again? Are we introducing only what would be quote unquote new, not something that previously existed in the code base? And when you start to look at those, you can begin to see trends and say, hey, look, we are continually getting better. Instead of finding 25 critical vulnerabilities with every merge or every security scan, we're now seeing 3. That's a trend that's going down. Oh, look, we're seeing a new trend that the mediums are going up. Well, should we be educating better? There are things that you can be able to pick up from that. And the one thing that I usually stress to people, it's also making sure your scan results are up to date. And that's another metric you can pull. To your comment, Mike, about I'm using something that's abandonware, if you've not pulled that software in a while and you're not scanning it, you're giving yourself an attack surface by choice, as opposed to making sure that's included in your practices and you're making sure it is on latest version, it is being scanned and all the things that go with that. But I do think that's the challenge. I think people need to look beyond that example I gave, which I think one of you laughed at, which I'm glad you laughed because it's funny looking back. It was a little painful at the time, right? But you need to figure out that you are testing that, you are measuring it, and you're seeing trends. And I guess I'll leave this as the final point to your question. Again, I don't think developers are waking up in the morning and saying, I want to create a 0-day today. Please, my day would be complete if I did that, right? So let's help them be better developers and also educate. I do occasionally see customers, not just here, but other places I've worked, where they'll say, what's a cross-site scripting attack? Or what's the SQL injection message I'm getting? Like, I don't understand it. Provide resources, help them learn, and you'll end up with better code at the end.
No, I love it. And I'm also going to steal what you said about API security, where API stands for assume positive intent. So that will be what I'm stealing from this particular session. But I think if there's any metric we're going by, it's that we do have it would be great to have a recurring conversation on these themes with you. I've quite enjoyed it. You just gave us some final words there on some metrics. Any other final words about either your work or something we should be looking forward to in the next couple of months?
Yeah, absolutely. So we at GitLab are taking security very seriously. We consider it part of the 3 pillars to make up the product. And that's because we see that as you get developers to be part of that security story, and highlight for you to kind of show that the first, we just recently announced a partnership with Aqua Security around Trivy. That's very exciting. That is 2 competitors working together to make security better for everyone. Part of that is we're now providing our vulnerability research at GitLab as a component of the Trivy open source project. So that's a huge thing for companies who do not have their own vulnerability research teams. Moving forward, some of the things I want to highlight for you, we are focusing on standard reporting practices, and some of that's going to be partnering with the Linux Foundation. Linux Foundation kicked off digital bill of materials as a way to get that traceability that we were talking about at the beginning. And GitLab sees it as very important, and we're going to be taking an active role in that working group and beginning to show what we're already doing today, because we do that as part of our product. You can actually get a software bill of materials, and we'll tell you what packager grabbed it, what it was, what packages it required, what packagers pulled those in, and giving that information. I would say the real final thing to highlight for you, and by the way, I would love to talk to both of you as much as you want to talk to me. So if you want to have a recurring conversation, I'm game. But we're working on what it means to have true traceability in vulnerabilities. And to kind of give you a sense of what that means, you can look at a vulnerability out of a SAST scanner, because it's looking at your source code, and say, that vulnerability was found on line 10 or line 100. Or if it's an enterprise application, probably line 100,000 because applications get really big.
True.
You cannot do that with DAST. DAST is a black box scanner. It's scanning the running application. However, having access to your source code and building abstract syntax trees for execution and call flow, we're working on how we tie that back to a line of code to help you find that vulnerability faster. We're also now doing that with container scanning as well as part of that partnership with Aqua. I expect that what you're going to see from GitLab is a lot better information and a lot more sharing. And if there's two things you take away, I would say GitLab believes security is a team effort and that we want to be that trusted partner in the industry. And we've built that strong relationship with customers today, which you can see in our reviews, white papers that our customers have done, as well as general industry reviews of what we're doing. So that's a little bit of what GitLab's doing, where we're going. And yeah, absolutely. I'd love to continue the conversation. Metrics is part of that theme this year and how we make metrics be more meaningful, more actionable, and of course, tied back to education.
Sounds awesome. And unfortunately, we have a metric of time working against us right now. So I do want to say once again, thanks, Dave, for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the time.
Also want to thank our listeners and John for joining us as well. If you'd like to learn more about GitLab, visit securityweekly.com/GitLab. And even though I know developers probably aren't waking up in the morning thinking, I want to write a critical zero day, hopefully they're waking up and thinking they want to find out what musical references ASW is making this week. And with that in mind, we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.